But before I look at specific instances, two general points. First, Simon Hornblower, writing about Thucydides' treatment of Athens, has remarked that he says very little about the council, and has suggested that there was a sinister purpose behind this, to make Athenian decision-making seem more impulsive and irresponsible than it actually was. I accept the fact, but not the sinister interpretation. When final decisions were made in the assembly, it's that meeting of the assembly on which Thucydides concentrates, and the council is omitted when it played its normal probulitic role, and it's included only when it played an exceptional role, as it did in 420 and in 411. Other Greek states are treated similarly, including Sparta, where the Gerousia was more powerful than the council in Athens, but is never mentioned by Thucydides at all. The same applies to Herodotus, which confirms me in my view there is nothing sinister in Thucydides' treatment. Sparta's Gerousia is mentioned as a creation of Lycurgus, as joining with the Ephors in putting pressure on Anaxandridas to take a second wife, where they threaten a decision by the Spartiates if he doesn't comply, and as including the two kings in its membership, where Herodotus seems to have thought that Thucydides denied that the kings had two popes each. Athens' Council of 500 isn't mentioned in connection with Cleisthenes' tribal reorganization. The council which resisted when Cleomenes of Sparta tried to dissolve it is probably Solon's Council of 400, not yet transformed into Cleisthenes' 500. And after that, as in Thucydides, the council is mentioned only when it did something unusual. In 480-479, when Mardonius sent Meurycides to offer a deal to Athens, one member, Lycides, wanted to put the offer to the assembly, but in reaction, the other members and those from outside lynched him, and their wives went to his house and killed his wife and children. Presumably, Meurycides' offer was not put to the assembly. Elsewhere, Herodotus mentions that in Cyrene, when Arcesilaus III, after killing or exiling his opponents, had fled to Barca, his mother Pheretyme exercised his privileges in Cyrene and inter alia attended the council. And in 481, before Xerxes' invasion, when Argos had consulted Delphi on how to respond, the envoys from the Greeks who wanted Argos to join in the resistance went to the Bouleuterion. The council stated the conditions on which Argos would join in. The envoys gave their reply to what they were told in the council, and the Argives indignantly told the envoys to be gone from Argos territory before sunset. In Greek cities which had the usual structure of council and assembly, it would be normal practice for envoys to go first to the council. How far the council could respond to the envoys without reference to the assembly would depend on relations between the two bodies in the city in question. In view of Herodotus' lack of similar references to the council in other states, I assume that his mention of the council here is intentional and not just casual. McCann and Howard Wells both remark on the council's power here. Howard Wells suggests that it may be the 80 rather than the council mentioned as swearing to the treaty with Athens in 420. But it now seems that in spite of what Herodotus says about the aftermath of the Battle of Sapphira about 494, Argos remained oligarchic until a major reorganization in the 460s. So probably we should accept that in 481, Argos did have a council which could indeed deal with the Greek envoys without reference to an assembly. An Argive assembly is attested in two inscriptions of the first half of the 5th century, but dates either about 480-475 or later have been proposed for these. Surprisingly, Probuleusis does appear in Xenophon's Hellenica, at Athens, though not in any other city. After the Battle of Arginusae in 406, the generals who returned to Athens and reported to the council were imprisoned on the orders of the council. When darkness fell before the first meeting of the assembly could decide, it ordered the council to submit a proboliuma to a subsequent meeting. That subsequent meeting was presented with the proboliuma of Calexinus, and on a first vote it preferred the alternative motion of Euryptolemus. But that vote was challenged, and on a second vote it condemned the generals in accordance with the proboliuma. And the council is mentioned on various later occasions. In 4054, before the Athenians finally accepted Sparta's peace terms, when Archestratus proposed to the council that the terms should be accepted, he was arrested, and there was a decree, Xenophon doesn't say whether a decree of the council or of the assembly, that nobody should propose that. In 371, the council was in session on the Acropolis when a herald arrived from the Thebans to announce their victory over the Spartans at Leuctra, and the council rebuffed the herald without consulting the assembly. After that, Xenophon reports 2 meetings of the council and assembly. In winter 373-69, when the Thebans invaded the Peloponnese, the Athenians held an assembly in accordance with a resolution of the council. Envoys from various states spoke, and the assembly voted to rally round with full force in support of Sparta. And in summer 369, when Athens and Sparta made a formal alliance, the assembly was presented with a proboliuma recommending that Sparta should command on land and Athens at sea, but a speech by Herodotus persuaded it to decide instead that the whole command should alternate every 5 days. The Hellenica Oxyrhynchia gives us an intriguing episode from 396, when some Athenians were beginning to contemplate an end to the dependence on Sparta imposed at the end of the Peloponnesian War. A man called Demynetus, not by a resolution of the people, but having conferred secretly with the council, it was said, set out with a trireme from Athens to join Conon in Cyprus. When this was discovered, there was a great commotion. The council called an assembly and pretended to know nothing about the matter. Opinions were divided, but the assembly reported the incident to the Spartan Harmos on Aegina, and he tried but failed to catch Demynetus off the east coast of Attica. But I return to Herodotus. One other general point about his language. For decisions of public bodies and individuals, he mostly uses 2 verbs, dokiein, to seem good, which is the commonest in this sense, both in Herodotus and in inscribed decrees, and handanein, to please, which he uses particularly with reference to Sparta, occasionally Thera and Thera's African colonies, although they didn't use handanein in their inscribed decrees, while some other states, notably those of Crete, did use it. That is, handanein seems for Herodotus simply to be a variant used for variety's sake, and it doesn't reflect the usage of the states in connection with which he uses it. To look at individual instances, I shall group together the decisions of particular states, and the state about which Herodotus is most informative is not Athens, but Sparta. There are various occasions when Herodotus mentions the ephors. When the Samian opponents of the tyrant Polycrates appealed to Sparta, they went to the archontes, and I assume that Herodotus means the ephors. This was the occasion when the Samians spoke at length and were rebuked by the Spartans for wasting words. But the episode ends with, it was decided to give support, and that decision ought to have been made by the assembly after probolusis by the Gerousia. Similarly, in 490, the runner from Athens went to the Archontes and addressed them as Lacedaemonioi. They decided to go in support, but couldn't go before the full moon, after which a force of Lacedaemonioi went to Marathon and saw the bodies. Again, I suspect that the runner from Athens went to the Ephors, but that the decision to support Athens should have been taken by the assembly after Probeleusis by the Gerousia, unless the assembly's decision had been taken earlier and all that was needed was that the Ephors should proclaim the campaign, as we shall see later. When Maiandrius of Samos fled to Sparta, he tried to bribe King Cleomenes. Cleomenes, less high-handed at the beginning of his reign than he became later, went to the Ephors and told them that Maiandrius should be gone from the Peloponnese, and they complied and proclaimed him out, Herodotus' only use of ekke russein. The impression which Herodotus gives is that Maiandrius Cleomenes to be the man who mattered, and Cleomenes' rejection of him was definitive, but it was the Ephors as executive officials whose job it was formally to order him to go. Earlier, when Anaxandridas' wife didn't bear him a son, it was the Ephors who told him to marry another wife. When he refused to do that, the Ephors and the Gerousia told him to keep his wife but marry a second as well, or else the Spartiates would take some decision. He did that. His second wife gave birth to Cleomenes. After that, his first wife became pregnant, and the Ephors sat in when she gave birth to Dorius. In the other royal family, two wives had been unable to bear a son to Aristone. He contrived to take over Agitus' wife, and she bore a son, Demaratus. The Spartiates, the full citizens, had prayed Pandeme for him to have a son. When he was born, Aristone was with the Ephors, apparently in an official context, and he counted the months and reckoned that the child couldn't be his. Later he did acknowledge Demaratus, but the remark was remembered, and when Leotychidas was prompted by Cleomenes to challenge Demaratus, he cited the remark and called the Ephors who had heard it as witnesses. The Spartiates decided to consult Delphi, and the Pythia, corrupted by Cleomenes, pronounced that Demaratus was not Aristone's son. Cleomenes, after his failure to take Argos about 494, was brought before the Ephors. They arranged a trial at which he gave a religious explanation, and in saying that he was judged by the Spartiates to be saying what was credible and reasonable, and he escaped his prosecutors by far. In all these cases, the Ephors seem to be involved from the beginning when questions arise about a king. They can work with the Gerousia, as in the case of Anaxandridas. Mention of the Spartiates probably refers to the assembly, which was presided over by the Ephors, which had its business prepared by the Gerousia, but whose right to have the last word was important when the authorities were not unanimous. In 479, when the Athenians wanted the Spartans to venture north of the Isthmus of Corinth once more, they sent messengers to Sparta, who went to the Ephors and spoke to them. The Ephors delayed replying from day to day. When Caelius of Tegea warned them of the risk of letting Athens go over to the Persians, they sent out during the night a force under Pausanias as regent for Pleistarchus, and he took a relative as a fellow commander. And the next morning, when the Athenians went back to the Ephors and did threaten to go over to the Persians, the Ephors told the Athenians that this force was on its way. Herodotus writes as if the Ephors acted on their own. In fact, it appears from Xenophon's Hellenica that decisions to go to war and within the war to send out a particular campaign and to appoint its commander, were taken by the polis, that is, by the assembly after Probolusis by the Gerousia, but it was the responsibility of the ephors to frueran fine, to proclaim the campaign. In this case, it must already have been decided that Leotychidas was to command at sea and Pausanias on land, and probably it was within the power of the ephors to decide when Pausanias and his army should go out. The last appearance of the ephors was after the Battle of Plataea, when a woman from Kos, defecting from the Persian side, made a supplication to Pausanias. He accepted her supplication, entrusted her to the ephors who were present, and afterwards at her request sent her to Aegina. And that fits something which we are told in Xenophon's Lac Pol, that when a king went out on campaign, 2 of the ephors accompanied him, not to interfere unless the king asked them to do so, but to observe what everybody did and to sophronidzein them all. For decisions of the Spartan assembly, Herodotus seems not to have been careful to distinguish between the Spartiates, the full citizens who constituted the assembly, and the Lacedaemonioi, the larger body of free men which included the Perioikoi. We've noticed that the ephors threatened a decision of the Spartiates if Anaxandridas didn't take a second wife. The Spartiates had prayed for a son for Ariston. The Spartiates decided to consult Delphi when Leotychidas challenged Demaratus' legitimacy, and Cleomenes' explanation of his failure to capture Argos was accepted by the Spartiates. Dorius asked the Spartiates for colonists to take to Libya, and the Spartiates are mentioned also as sending Leonidas to Thermopylae without waiting for the Carnea, and intending to go in full force after. And the Spartiates again as deciding after Plataea that the bravery of Aristotemus didn't count because he was the survivor of Thermopylae who had that disgrace to wipe out. But more often Herodotus writes of the Lacedaemonioi, though the Spartiates creep in from time to time. It was the Lacedaemonioi who condemned Lycas on a false charge so that he could go to Tegea and obtain the bones of Orestes, who made an alliance with Croesus of Lydia, who decided simply to send a single ship when the Ionians appealed after Cyrus' conquest of Lydia, who in the legendary past had dealt with the Minians expelled from Lemnos by the Pelasgians, who made Cleomenes rather than Dorius king after the death of Anaxandridas, who after their failed attempt to overthrow Cleisthenes' regime in Athens, proposed to their allies that they should reinstate Hippias, who in the legendary past had planned to make the elder son of Aristodemus king, who pursued Demaratus when he fled from Sparta. The court which condemned Leotychidas when he took bribes in Thessaly after the Persian War isn't indicated, but the court which tried him when the Aeginetans complained after the downfall of Cleomenes was convened by the Lacedaemonioi. In 519, the Plataeans offered themselves to Cleomenes and the Lacedaemonioi when they were in the vicinity, and the Lacedaemonioi advised them to appeal rather to Athens. The Lacedaemonioi honoured Themistocles after Salamis. When Alexander of Macedon went from Mardonius to Athens, the Lacedaemonioi sent messengers. The Athenians delayed replying to Alexandria until the Lacedaemonioi could hear their reply. The men from Sparta said that they had been sent by the Lacedaemonioi, and the Athenians said that they could understand the fear that they might go over to Persia, but it was a misjudgment of them. Contrasted with this picture of decisions by the Spartiates or Lacedaemonioi is the report that about 506, after Cleisthenes' reforms in Athens, King Cleomenes raised an army from the whole Peloponnese, that is from Sparta's alliance, the Peloponnesian League, without saying what its purpose was. The purpose was in fact clear enough for the Boeotians and Chalcidians to attack Attica too, though the specific purpose alleged by Herodotus to make Isagoras tyrant may not have been stated. Cleomenes was accompanied on the campaign by his fellow king Demaratus. Herodotus says nothing about the mechanism by which the Spartan army was sent out under the joint command of the two kings, and he concentrates on the summons to the allies. It isn't clear whether at that date Cleomenes had a formal right to call on the allies, or by force of personality he simply did that, or this has simply been invented to help account for the desertions of the Corinthians and Demaratus afterwards. As a result of this difference, Herodotus goes on to say, a law was enacted at Sparta that it should not be permitted to both kings to accompany an army when it's sent out. And that law is presumably to be attributed to the assembly after Probolusis by the Gerusia. The law was challenged when Demaratus incited Aegina to refuse Cleomenes' demand for hostages after it had acceded to Darius' demand for earth and water. And Cleomenes, in response, didn't stand on the law, but arranged for Demaratus to be deposed and succeeded by Leotychidas. The two kings together took hostages from Aegina to Athens. After Cleomenes had come to a grisly end, the Aeginetans complained to Sparta. Leotychidas was sent to ask Athens to return the hostages, and then Athens in turn refused to give up the hostages simply to one king. Another change, which seems to have resulted from the fiasco of about 506, was that after that the allies were consulted before being called to take action, but they were committed to what the majority decided, unless there was something from gods and heroes to prevent it. Thus, when the Spartans wanted to reinstate Hippias in Athens, they called a meeting of their allies. Socles of Corinth led the opposition. All the others adopted the Corinthians' position, and so the matter was ended. In the Greek alliance to resist Xerxes' invasion in 480, Herodotus reports meetings of representatives, probuloi, probably at the Isthmus of Corinth in the autumn of 481, and certainly there before and after the expedition to Thessaly in the spring of 480. Envoys were sent in 481 to other states which it was hoped would join, and when Argos priced for joining was a 30-year peace treaty and an equal share in the command, the Spartans said that they would consult the larger number, presumably the Spartan assembly, about a treaty, but they couldn't give Argos more than a 1/3 share in the command. After the spring of 480, no further such meetings are mentioned, but we hear of many councils of war in situ, where the Spartan commander consulted the commanders of the other contingents. A recurring motif in this war is that the Greeks are frightened before engaging, but then proceed to fight bravely. For instance, at Thermopylae, when Xerxes was approaching, the Greeks deliberated about withdrawal. The other Peloponnesians wanted to retire to the Isthmus of Corinth, but when the Phocians and Locrians objected to that, Leonidas voted to stay there and to appeal for reinforcements, and as commander he got his way. When the Persians used the mountain path and rendered the Greek position untenable, opinions were divided. The upshot was that most escaped while they could, but Leonidas and the Spartans stayed, together with the Thebans and the Thespians. Herodotus' opinion was that those who escaped didn't desert, but were dismissed by Leonidas, while the Thespians chose to stay, but the Thebans were kept as hostages. Leonidas died, so nobody will have been able to obtain his version. Before the Battle of Salamis, Herodotus gives us a whole series of Greek councils at which Themistocles has to argue again and again for staying at Salamis and not withdrawing to the Peloponnese. When the fleet had assembled, it debated where to fight. The Spartan commander Eurybiadas invited Tomboulomenon, whoever wished, to state his opinion, and the majority preferred the isthmus. After the Persians had captured the Acropolis, the Greeks decided to withdraw to the isthmus, and some started preparing to leave. After that, Nicephorus warned Themistocles of the danger, and he persuaded the Spartan Eurybiadas to call a third council. That met during the night, and Themistocles threatened an Athenian departure to the west and persuaded Eurybiadas to stay. After the arrival of the Persian fleet, there was yet another council, and Themistocles, opposed by all the Peloponnesians, left the meeting and sent Sicinus with his message to incite Xerxes to attack before the Greeks could leave Salamis. And then came the battle in which the Greeks fought bravely and successfully. Realistically, once the argument for staying had been made and had prevailed, it ought not to have needed to be repeated. But the repeated panics and debates heighten the great success when it comes. Themistocles features again in a debate after the battle. The Greeks pursued the departing Persian fleet as far as Andros without catching it and held a debate there. Themistocles wanted to go on to the Hellespont and destroy Xerxes' bridges. Eurybiadas thought Xerxes should be allowed to return to Asia, and the other Peloponnesian generals agreed. Themistocles then defended to the Athenians the view which had been opposed to his own, and he sent Sicinus to Xerxes again to tell him that Themistocles had prevented the Greeks from sailing to destroy his bridges, and so to pave the way for his own fleeing to the Persians later. Here, improbability is piled on improbability. That Themistocles should pose as champion of the view opposed to his, that he should expect Xerxes to trust a second message from Sicinus when the first had led to his defeat at Salamis, that he could foresee in 480 that he would later want to flee to the Persians. For Athens, many decisions are reported. As I noted earlier, the council's part in the decision-making process isn't mentioned except for the occasion in 480-479, when it reacted angrily to the mission of Euripides and presumably didn't put his offer to the assembly. A matter often discussed is the departure of the elder Miltiades to rule over the Dolonci and the Chersonese. Herodotus represents it as a private venture of Miltiades, since he was irritated by the regime of Pisistratus and wanted to be out of the way. But it was in some sense a public matter, for which he took on all of the Athenians who were willing to share in the expedition. And when the younger Miltiades went to take over, he was sent to the Chersonese in a trireme by the Pisistrates to take over the affairs. It may well have suited the elder Miltiades to leave Athens, but clearly his mission made the Chersonese an outpost of Pisistrate Athens. Similarly, when Dorius of Sparta left Sparta to get out of the way of his stepbrother Cleomenes, he went not as an individual in a huff, but on officially sanctioned expeditions. When the younger Miltiades led his expedition against Peros in 489, Herodotus says that he asked the Athenians for 70 ships and a force and money, not stating which land he was going to campaign against, but saying that he would enrich them if they followed him. This recalls Cleomenes summoning the Peloponnesians against Athens about 506. And as in the case of Cleomenes, it's perhaps intended to prepare us for the disastrous outcome. It's unlikely to be true, and Herodotus' contrast of a pretext, prophesis or schema, with a personal motive suggests that Peros was publicly declared as the objective. There's a point of uncertainty concerning the 3 judicial decisions reported in Book 6. When Phrynichus distressed the Athenians with his tragedy, The Capture of Miletus, the Athenians fined him 1,000 drachmae, and they prescribed that nobody should ever stage that play. Before Marathon, when Miltiades returned from the Chersonese, his enemies brought him before the court and prosecuted him for his tyranny in Chersonese. But he was acquitted. And after Marathon, when Miltiades' expedition to Paros ended in failure, Xanthippus brought him before the demos on a capital charge, prosecuting him on the grounds of deceiving the Athenians, and the demos didn't condemn him to death, but did fine him 50 talents. These are 3 out of 6 Athenian trials in the early 5th century for which the procedure is debatable. The other 3 are the condemnation of Hipparchus, son of Carmus, and of Themistocles, and the acquittal of Cimon. I've suggested all of Herodotus' cases may have been brought to a court, perhaps the undivided Iliaia, when the losing party in a case originally brought to an official exercised his right of appeal. Hansen doesn't discuss the case of Phrynichus, but regards all the other 5 of instances of asangelia. One other city worth noticing is Miletus. Perhaps in the 6th century it suffered from stasis for 2 generations, and it then invited Paros to send rectifiers, katos hysteres. They inspected the territory and then called an assembly at which they instructed the Miletians to accept the government of those whose own lands were well tended. By the time of Darius' Scythian expedition campaign, about 514, Miletus was under the rule of a pro-Persian tyrant, Histiaeus. Herodotus consistently regards him as the real tyrant of Miletus, even after he had gone elsewhere, and Aristagoras as his deputy, Epitropos. But I think that was to make too regularly institutional a phenomenon of tyranny. Aristagoras in turn appointed a deputy when he went to Mersinus, and Histiaeus appointed another deputy in Byzantium when he returned from there to the Aegean. Aristagoras embarked on the Ionian revolt through fear that after the failure of the campaign against Naxos, which he had instigated, he would be deprived of his kingship of Miletus. He began by, in theory, logo, resigning his tyranny and creating isonomia in Miletus, and securing the deposition of the tyrants of the other cities, but until he departed to Mersinus, he retained some kind of commanding position. Indeed, Herodotus calls him tyrant of Miletus on his arrival in Sparta to seek help there, and makes him call himself tyrant of Miletus when he invites deported Paeonians to return home. Herodotus represents the Ionian revolt as the personal venture of Aristagoras, who began by deliberating metatone stasiotion with the dissidents, or perhaps with his own partisans, and they decided to revolt. Similarly, before he went to Mersinus, he deliberated with his partisans, and various proposals were made. But we also have to accommodate the Ionian koinon and estimate how far the revolt was a venture of the koinon rather than of Aristagoras. The koinon was first mentioned at the time of Cyrus' conquest of Lydia, when the Ionians, whose 12 cities shared a sanctuary of Poseidon at the Panionion on Mycale, met there and decided to appeal to Sparta, with the exception of Miletus on that occasion, since Miletus had converted its special relationship with Croesus to a special relationship with Cyrus. Those meetings continued, and on another occasion, Bias of Priene proposed that they should all migrate to Sardinia, while Thales of Miletus proposed that they should not physically migrate, but should make a political synoicism centered on Teos. But neither of those things actually happened. The koinon next appears before Aristagoras went to Myrsinus, when the Ionian revolt spread to Cyprus. The Cyprians appealed to the Ionians, and the Ionians, without spending long in deliberation, came with a large mission. The Cyprians invited the Ionians to choose whether to fight on land and let the Cyprians use their ships, or at sea, and they replied that they had been sent by the koinon of the Ionians to guard the sea. When Histiaeus returned from Susa, was distrusted by Artaphernes in Sardis and therefore went to Chios, he was first arrested by the Chians, but persuaded them that he was on their side, and he was released. And then, according to Herodotus, he was questioned by the Ionians about his advice to Aristagoras to revolt, and he replied with the alleged plan to exchange the populations of Ionia and Phoenicia. A formal meeting of Ionian delegates at this point is unlikely, and it may be that here the Ionians is a careless slip by Herodotus for the Chians. One further meeting of the koinon is attested when the Persians were striking back, and it was the koinon which decided to leave Miletus to defend itself on land, while the combined navy was to go to Lade and prevent Miletus from being blockaded by sea as well as by land. There were then agorae among the forces assembled at Lade, and it was at one of those that Dionysius of Phocea offered himself as trainer and was accepted. We can't be sure how far Herodotus' focus on the personal involvement of Aristagoras and Histiaeus is misleading, but for the revolt to have happened, the koinon must at least have been willing to go along with Aristagoras when he turned against the Persians. Another city where we have to unravel the interaction of tyrants and people is Samos. In the 530s and 520s, Samos prospered under the tyrant Polycrates and captured many of the islands and also many cities on the mainland. Whether Polycrates' reign in fact began earlier or predecessors' achievements have been attributed to him, I need not discuss here. He sent to fight for the Persian king Cambyses men whom he didn't want back in Samos. They went to Sparta and asked for support against Polycrates. Sparta and Corinth attacked Samos, but without success, and the dissident Samians then had further adventures. Oroetes, the Persian governor of Sardis, enticed Polycrates to Sardis and had him killed. Polycrates had made Meandrius his deputy epitropos in Samos. Meandrius had an assembly convened, at which he said that he wanted to give the Samians freedom and to resign the tyranny while keeping some privileges. But when one leading citizen attacked him for that, he changed his mind, stayed in power, and imprisoned his opponents. Polycrates' brother Silosone had met Darius in Cambyses' entourage in Egypt. Darius sent a Persian force to install Silosone, and originally that was done without opposition, but Meandrius escaped, his brother led an attack on the Persians, and the Persians reacted violently before handing over the devastated island to Silosone. Meandrius now appealed to Sparta, but his bribes failed to gain support from Cleomenes. We don't know what became of Meandrius in the end. By the time of Darius' Scythian campaign, about 514, Silosone had been succeeded by his son Eaces. Eaces was one of the tyrants deposed at the beginning of the Ionian revolt. Before the Battle of Lade, the Persians tried to use the ex-tyrants to win over their cities, and originally that failed. But after seeing the resistance of the training regime of Dionysius of Phocea, the Samian generals did desert, and they were followed by other contingents, though the commanders of 11 Samian ships disobeyed their generals and refused to desert, in return for which the koinon of the Samians afterwards set up a stele commemorating their loyalty to the cause. After the battle, the propertied Samians, disapproving of the desertion, decided not to wait for the reinstallation of Eoces and accepted an invitation to the Ionians from the people of Zancli in Sicily to go and colonize Cali Acti there. And in collusion from Naxilas of Rhegium and Hippocrates of Pila, they actually seized Zancli. That's as far as Herodotus takes their story, but in fact, after 7 years, Anaxilas expelled them, resettled the city, and changed its name to Messana. Meanwhile, in Samos, Eoces was reinstated and the city wasn't damaged. Samos fought on the Persian side in 480, and a man called Theomestor was made tyrant after distinguishing himself at Salamis. In 479, 3 Samians went to the Greek fleet at Delos without the knowledge of the Persians and Theomestor to urge it to advance to Asia Minor, and on behalf of Samos they were admitted to the Greek alliance. In 500 Athenians captured by Xerxes the previous year were released and sent home, and that can hardly have happened without Theomestor's knowledge. At Mycale, the Samians on the Persian side were disarmed and did what they could to help the Greeks, and after the battle the Greeks returned to Samos, held a council at which the Greeks successfully opposed the suggestion that the Ionians should be transported from Asia Minor to somewhere safer, and the Samians and other islanders were formally admitted to the Greek alliance. I've almost finished, but finally the Persians. Herodotus knew that the Persian king was a powerful monarch who didn't need to have his plans approved by assemblies. But there is one odd episode. When Cyrus was a young man, had discovered his parentage and was living in Persia, Harpagus, who had been punished by the Median king for failing to have the infant Cyrus killed, sent a message to Cyrus to invite him to head a Persian revolt against the Medes. Cyrus summoned an assembly, Haliae, of the Persians. He read out a document which he had written, stating that King Astyages had appointed him general of the Persians. He then gave them a sample of a hard life and a sample of a luxurious life, and promised to lead them in a war for liberation and a luxurious life. Several peoples were persuaded to join in, so that it's hard to envisage the assembly or the subsequent life samples. Howe and Wells don't comment. Asheri suggests that when he became vassal king of Anshan, Cyrus may have led a parade of the multinational Median army. Briand expresses general skepticism about the story of Cyrus and his challenge to the Medes. But this story of an assembly and the 2 life samples looks more appropriate to a Greek city-state than to a large kingdom. The king did discuss policy with those around him. According to Herodotus, the succession to Darius was disputed between Artabazanes, the eldest of all his sons, and Xerxes, the eldest of his sons by Cyrus' daughter Atossa. Herodotus attributes Xerxes prevailing to the arrival of Demaratus, with a Spartan view that a son born after his father's accession took precedence, and to the influence of Atossa. In fact, it's likely that Xerxes had already been designated heir before Demaratus arrived at the Persian court, and Atossa was important in the royal household, but not in affairs of state, as the mother of the heir, rather than vice versa. But it presumably is true that distinguished Greeks who arrived at the Persian court were used by the king when questions concerning the Greeks arose, but only then. Histiaeus of Miletus is represented as an honoured, if compulsory, guest at Darius' court, trusted by him apart from one moment of suspicion, but not trusted by other Persians. Such Greeks could accompany the king or other commanders on expeditions, as Hippias of Athens accompanied Datis and Artaphernes to Marathon, and Demaratus of Sparta accompanied Xerxes to Greece. The invasion of Greece in 480 was a project which Xerxes inherited from Darius to avenge the defeat at Marathon. Herodotus represents him as unenthusiastic but incited by Mardonius. He called a select conference of Sulagon Epicleton of the best Persians, at which he announced his intentions. Mardonius encouraged him, and Artabanus opposed him, and dreams tipped the balance in favour of going to war. As Briand says, this entire discussion raises strong suspicions, since both the speeches given and the arguments exchanged totally derive from a judgment post-eventum. Beyond that, we may wonder where Herodotus might have obtained this account of an episode involving Xerxes and leaving Persians. So there I end. This isn't the kind of paper that culminates in a conclusion. It's been an exploration of how Herodotus deals with public decision-making by different bodies in different contexts. Thank you.